notice, and I'd especially like to thank our panelists who momentarily I'll introduce to you for joining us at equally short notice. And Nicholas Snow, who I'll introduce momentarily for postponing his departure back to Lebanon in order to be at this event. What we're going to be looking at this afternoon with what I think is going to be a fascinating panel is the bigger question of US policy in Lebanon looking forward. Not an issue that necessarily attracts as much attention as other Middle East issues in this town. I think there might be something of an expectation that a great deal of attention was paid to Lebanon over the last years, not always necessarily in the most constructive of ways, and perhaps Lebanon is due to get less attention in the next period, although I'd be interested in hearing whether our panelists would disagree with that suggestion. What we're doing, though, is organizing today's session around the paper, which those of you who haven't taken a copy and who aren't put off by the obvious weight of so many pieces of paper are very much invited to pick up a copy of on your way out. This event is jointly hosted by the New America Foundation and the Century Foundation, which means I can wear both my hats at once, which is an unusual and enjoyable thing. The paper that we're sharing with you, but this is a draft paper, as you will see, is written. So it says not for quotation or circulation. Clearly, we're circulating it today. But I think we mean by that, don't circulate it further and don't quote it, because this will undergo further revisions before it becomes a paper that the Century Foundation puts out. I imagine we'll manage to do that before the Christmas break. Obviously, this is a paper that Nicholas Snow has written. Nicholas is going to give us a presentation of the ideas and suggestions and analysis that he raises in that paper, and then we're going to have Muna and Bilal respond to Nicholas, and we'll take the conversation in the directions it will go in. And obviously, I'll try and keep those introductory comments on all parts down in terms of time so that we can turn this into a conversation. The paper is reimagining the Lebanon track towards a new US policy, and that paper is coming out as TCF. It's obviously the opinions of Nicholas Snow, not necessarily of the Century Foundation. So let me introduce to you who Nicholas Snow is. Those of you who, like myself, subscribe to the Mideast Wire, which I've found to be a phenomenal resource, will probably know who Nicholas Snow is. Nick has spent the last 5 years in Lebanon. He launched, I believe it was almost 2 years ago now?
Almost 4 years.
Almost 4 years ago. I clearly haven't been a subscriber since day one. Almost 4 years ago now, the Mideast Wire, which is a news translation service of the Arabic and Iranian media in Lebanon. Nick is doing his PhD at Hadath. He is originally American, studied at Brown, and more importantly, studied at Cambridge University, as far as I'm concerned. After that, and he edited a 2007 book, The Voice of Hezbollah, The Statements of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. So I'm going to introduce our other speakers. That's who Nick is, and I'm going to momentarily ask Nick to step up to the podium. Our first respondent and discussant will be Mona Yakubian, who many of you who attend these events in Washington and follow what people are writing here will be very familiar with. At the moment, Mona is the Special Advisor on the Muslim World Initiative at the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. Muna at USIP, of course. Mona in the past has been at the State Department, a North African analyst focusing on Algeria at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. I particularly enjoyed something that Muna produced recently together with a colleague, Scott Lazinski, which was a paper on dealing with Damascus, which was actually put out by the Council of Foreign Relations, looking at US-Syria policy. So Mona also has a background at RAND, at the World Bank, at Freedom House, and very much her bio speaks for itself, and we'll invite Mona up after that. And our final panelist, who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting in the past, but I'm very glad that you joined us, Bilal, is Bilal Saab. Bilal is at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, where he focuses on global terrorism, on Middle East security. He's a counterterrorism consultant with a number of setups and is, including the Jane's Information Group and Jane's Foreign Report and Jane's Intelligence Review. He has been in the past also not only in Beirut, which I understand where you grew up, is that right, where you grew up? But was also at St Andrews, which is another UK link. So you've got to give me your UK link, Mona, and then I can complete that set. The other thing that I believe, especially this week, we need to credit you with, Bilal, is in your capacity at Brookings, I understand you were president when the outgoing president gave his valedictory speech on Middle East policy. And Bilal has told me that he managed to keep a straight face when the following words were uttered by President Bush last Friday at the museum. When talking about Middle East policy, he said, as with any large undertaking, these efforts have not always gone according to plan. And in some areas, we've fallen short of our hopes. For example, the fight in Iraq has been longer and more costly than expected. Despite these frustrations and disappointments, the Middle East in 2008 is a freer, more hopeful and more promising place than it was in 2001. So you sat through that, you kept a straight face. My credit to you, Bilal. I hope I haven't embarrassed you by just saying that. You also kept the straight face.
My friends are holding me.
Okay.
I'm standing up.
So I will take my tongue out of my cheek now and return to being serious and open this up by inviting Nicholas up to give his opening comments. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Daniel. Actually, if it's all right, just a bit more casual, sit down, make my remarks. First thing is to thank Daniel and thank Mona and Bilal also, and also Michael Hanna at Century Foundation, who's been sort of slogging through this 100-page document over the last couple of months with me, which is admirable. And also, it's an honor for me to be here with these panelists. I think if the Bush administration had perhaps listened more to what they'd written over the last couple of years, we might have had a far different Lebanon policy for Lebanon, for the U.S., and for its allies. My hope is that the Obama administration that's coming in listens to folks like this. I'm not entirely convinced that that's going to be the case, sadly. And I think Bilal actually just wrote a piece for Jane's where he sort of argued on Lebanon that may be the case, that we may be in for perhaps not more of the same, but not too much effort, not too much difference, not the sort of paradigm shift that I'm arguing is necessary if we're going to avoid violence both for Lebanese, for the U.S., for its allies, for Israel. So let me just quickly talk about the main points in the paper. The first premise is, I think, the most important one to get through, which is the sort of dominant thinking that I've seen, dominant public thinking, let's say, which is what I'm relying on, public statements, public documents, some of the working group papers, white papers, etc., speeches, interviews. The dominant thinking seems to be that there isn't a viable sort of roadmap or pathway to peace building in Lebanon domestically. That, in other words, we really need to, as the United States, and as Lebanon, as March 14th, whoever it may be, needs to focus on the issues outside of Lebanon. That mainly means the track with Iran. That also means the Syrian-Israeli peace track as well. So the idea being, and I talk a little bit about some of Bilal's work, and correct me if I'm wrong in your comments, but one of his points has been that we're really not going to see much movement in Lebanon unless there's movement on one or both of these tracks. Let's say rapprochement with Iran, between Iran and the United States, and let's say movement towards a peace agreement, Syria and Israel. I think the opening point in the paper is that one, that's not a very good bet to make, given the past history, given the difficulty of success on either of those tracks. So just given that history, I think it makes sense on its face to try and come up with a sort of feasible Lebanon-focused strategy. That is something that has been sort of abandoned, especially since May 8th, since the sort of May violence, the takeover by the opposition briefly in Lebanon and the Doha agreement that followed. I think also what is dangerous about that is that we face a critical, the United States, when I say we, face a critical 6-7 months in the region, of course. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount, there's a cascading series of elections that I think is probably unprecedented, and ironically comes at the end of the Bush administration. You have provincial elections in Iraq, presidential in Iran, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Afghanistan, etc. So Lebanon is going to have parliamentary elections in 6-7 months. This is a critical period for the United States to try and make what I would call for a dramatic change in its policy. And that sort of dramatic change, if it's executed before those elections, could really help what it considers its allies, March 14th. And we can go into later whether or not they should be considered our allies or whether there are other allies that we should be thinking about, potentially. But this could play a critical role in these elections. It is a red state, blue state situation in Lebanon right now. I mean, we're talking about red state, blue state 2000, 2004. Narrowly divided. The thinking, and I think Mona and Bilal will have perhaps more thoughts on this, but the thinking that the opposition could indeed win the majority, but it's going to be very close. And indeed, even if the opposition wins the majority, the ability to govern will still, as Hezbollah said the other day, and as I think most political analysis analysts will agree, it's going to have to be through a unity government. So either way, things are going to be very circumscribed in Lebanon for either the current majority, who the United States supports, or the opposition, were they to get the majority. I think that's important to keep in mind. The sort of next thing to say is if we're looking at what to do on Lebanon, and we look at the sort of ideas that I'm going to briefly map out here on what I think is a reasonable change of strategy by the United States, or led by the United States, we need to also consider what our alternatives are. And right now, the alternatives to this path, I think, are not very promising. I would argue that even though there seems to be renewed discussion in Israel about the necessity of another war in Lebanon, against Hezbollah, that track is particularly bad for the United States. It's bad for Lebanon. It's bad for Israel. Bad for the region on a whole, for a whole host of reasons that we could talk about. There is another option, which is to basically, in a way, muddle through. Kind of, perhaps don't be as provocative and as inflexible as the Bush administration has been over the last couple of years. Gradually kind of equip the Lebanese armed forces, mainly for counterterrorism within the country. And really not affect a big paradigm shift, let's say, in Lebanon. I think that is doomed to failure, given the dynamics in the region, given the dynamics in Lebanon. I think that ultimately, that means that the United States has given up and has accepted that there's going to be renewed violence, either domestically within Lebanon amongst the competing factions, or with sort of regional players, Israel, etc. So that strategy is not a particularly good one. I'm leaving aside the sort of Iranian and Syrian track, because again, I think that the dominant thinking has really led us away from thinking about what we can do within Lebanon. Certainly, if there is a Syrian-Israeli peace agreement, that would make domestic peace building in Lebanon far easier. If there's a rapprochement with Iran, that would make domestic peace building in Lebanon far easier, certainly. However, that said, I don't think either of those scenarios are particularly likely. And I think in that case, we need to think more deeply about what to do in Lebanon. Let me just briefly sort of outline what I'm proposing, but start with, I think, the sort of second most important thing that I want to argue in the paper, that I do argue in the paper, which is Hezbollah. The focus of the paper, and indeed the focus of U.S. interests in Lebanon, for better or worse, I assume this as such, is Hezbollah's independent weaponry. I actually think we could have a very productive discussion about thinking of U.S. interests in Lebanon differently, thinking about U.S. relationship with Israel differently, but I don't think that really helps a broader discussion in Washington or the U.S. for some of these other ideas. So that said, an understanding of Hezbollah is critical. The United States has, over the last 3 years, since they were thrust into the enviable situation, not just by luck, but also by some good work on the part of the U.S. and its allies after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005, found itself in a very advantageous position. And this has to be remembered, that in April 2005, after Syria's 30,000 troops and most of its intelligence agents had left the country, the U.S. was really ascendant. Its power in Lebanon was really ascendant. There was a range of possible contingencies. Which way should the United States policy go? I argue in the paper that the choices that we pursued were almost uniformly disastrous in the end, and we can evaluate each one of those, and the paper does, 3 years, 4 years on from that. But I think the most important part of that was that on simple issues, relatively simple issues, given the difficult issues in the region, like the Sheba farms, small strip of territory that Hezbollah considers to be occupied by Israel, that many Lebanese agree with is occupied by Israel. Unfortunately, the United States was never able to make a convincing case to the Israelis of why it makes sense to give up Sheba farms, why that would lead to an endpoint goal of Hezbollah's integration into the democratic government of Lebanon. The reason being that the United States kept on arguing. We know this pretty much from the public record, and we know this from Jeffrey Feltman, the former ambassador, and his various statements and discussions, etc. And I garnered this through various interviews with figures in Lebanon. Basically, Feltman argued, and the U.S. argued, that this would be a good thing for the Israelis to do because it would prop up the government of Fuad Sinyor, March 14th, one of the main characters there as the current prime minister also. They never really could make a convincing argument to the Israelis of why it made sense beyond propping up Signora's government. The Israelis, by their own self-interest, why should they give up this card, a card in a larger sort of game, that's just going to momentarily prop up someone that's not particularly reliable and doesn't really have much strength, or his allies have much strength on the ground, as we saw in May. So without being able to understand the way that Hezbollah operates in Lebanon, the way, at a deeper level, how Lebanese political structures operate, you cannot make a convincing case that there is a possible roadmap for Hezbollah's integration into the democratic state of Lebanon. I think that is possible. The first thing to say on that score, the way that I see Hezbollah operating is basically in a series of concentric circles. These are sort of political circles, let's say. The outer circle, the largest one, would be Lebanon, with its range of limitations. These are legal constitutional limitations embodied in Ta'if, embodied in the new constitution after the Civil War, embodied in the sectarian system, that make it difficult for any one actor, one sectarian actor especially, to operate. Doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it difficult. There are a range of other limiting factors that we talk about that are inherent in Lebanon. If you go down further, I think the concentric circle that you get with Hezbollah at its core is its political alliances. And these are not the sort of Shiite political alliances. These are the other crucial alliances. The one that comes to mind, of course, is the alliance with the Free Patriotic Movement led by General Michel Aoun. This alliance has withstood basically burnished in 2006 before the Israel-Lebanon war that summer. This has provided Hezbollah with an ally who, no matter his decline in popularity, is still the most popular, single most popular Christian politician in the country. That this alliance has withstood a war, social upheaval, economic upheaval, assassinations, unrest, a virtual civil war essentially in Beirut and elsewhere, is a testament, I think, to how badly the United States calculated in those heady first few months after Syria got kicked out. To have the most popular Christian leader aligned with what the U.S. considers the worst terrorist group in the country, the A-team of terrorism, just on its face, something went terribly wrong vis-a-vis U.S. policy. If you drill down further to the concentric circles, you see, I would consider it to be Hezbollah's sort of Shiite constituency, of which it's supported, in virtually unanimously. But again, with each of these circles, there are wedges, there are splits, there are important differences. I think on that concentric circle, you would put the alliance with Amal, which is sort of sometimes, I think, wrongly considered a sort of secular Shiite party, which is not necessarily true, as I think a lot of Lebanon watchers realize that Amal has actually been the worst sectarian actor, according to some accounts, in Lebanon. I think that's something important to keep in mind. If you drill down further, you get really to Hezbollah's base of support, which is very small in Lebanon's overall schematic. And then you get down to Hezbollah's cadres and its officials. And again, on the Shiite circle, I would consider also Sayyid Fadlallah there as well, one of the leading critics of the Iranian regime, and also an important, I'd say probably the most compelling critic of Hezbollah itself on a range of issues. So if you look at Hezbollah in sort of a political analysis perspective, and you see what Hezbollah says about these concentric circles, there's more detail in the paper, but the sort of headline is basically that Hezbollah itself has said that their strength rests on two legs, resistance and public support for the resistance. And you cannot have one without the other. This goes counter to a lot of the United States thinking, and at least the US officials that I've talked to, who can't see how Hezbollah is able to mobilize reason and rationality, mobilize Lebanese self-interest in these different concentric circles. I think if you recognize how Hezbollah articulates its own sort of vulnerabilities at these different layers, a path towards integrating their independent weaponry into the democratic state is possible. And the sort of overall argument is that there may be risks associated with that, but those risks are far better than the current risks that exist with some of these other options. I'll close with the kind of quick rundown of the actual, let's say, recommendations. First one is healing the bleeding wounds. This should be a no-brainer in a way. That's perhaps, as soon as I say that, that's easy in a way for someone who is not Lebanese or not Israeli to say. But relative to the other conflicts in the region, these are very solvable. The three bleeding wounds are occupied, disputed territory. I think it's pretty clear that it's occupied territory. In northern Rajar, village Kfar Shuba, which is nearby, and Sheba Farms. The recommendation in the paper is that the Israelis, by getting Sheba Farms, this file, off of their plate, what they would be doing is not giving a card or a win to Hezbollah. They would be turning it over to the Syrians. Hey, get it off our ledger. Syria, you better demarcate your border because now it's not in our hands anymore. This is your problem. They'd also be giving it to the legitimate government of Lebanon, ostensibly. The second one is data regarding cluster munitions fired in 2006 war. My understanding in interviews with UN officials and others is this, the failure to turn over this data, which we should remember that one Lebanese citizen gets killed every month by these things, and it remains an open bleeding wound, is largely due to the fact that the Israelis don't have the two things. In certain cases, don't have the firing data, or have it and realize that in both cases, it would show or prove that the firing of cluster munitions, millions in the closing 2 days of the war, were fired indiscriminately in violation of international law. The Israelis need to come clean, get that off their ledger. The last one is perhaps more difficult, which is the issue of overflights. And again, this bleeding wounds phrase is the one that's repeatedly used by Nasrallah and Hezbollah and others, including March 14th. The overflights, the Israelis have argued, are for intelligence gathering purposes. Well, we know from leaked IDF documents that that's actually far less of a concern for the Israelis. They use the overflights for political power, to put pressure on, mainly to put pressure on the European Union and the Americans and others, the Syrians, etc., to sort of implement UN Security Council resolutions. The second thing to be said is that within this issue, there remains a lot of possibilities for conditionality. In other words, perhaps, the paper argues, we should, as a first step, work with the Israelis to end manned overflights. Rely on the satellite reconnaissance, which the Israelis are among the best in the world on, having launched 2 new satellites in the last year and a half, Get rid of that, because as we know, that could be a major flashpoint for war. There is ways that people have talked about in Lebanon tying an end to overflights, which are violation of international law, tying an end to overflights to implementing some of the border control recommendations that the UN has between Syria and Lebanon to allay Israeli concerns. The last sort of parts of the plan are the bleeding wounds. Removing these will not be enough to reasonably force Hezbollah's integration into the state, its weapons. You'd need to seriously enhance the Lebanese armed forces. Unless the United States is willing to, and its allies, is willing to accept and hopefully aid the creation of a strong national defense, this is not going to get done. The two most important stipulations there are that we cannot arm the Lebanese army to go after Hezbollah. That's a losing strategy. It's not going to work. The second thing is that if we enhance the LAF, we have to accept a recalibration of Israel's qualitative military edge. We're going to have to accept that. Now, there are great degrees that one can go to, and there's a lot of conditionality that can be attached to that. For example, credible air defense, which is affordable. Baltic states have just done that for under $100 billion. It's not, as Murr said the other day, that $1.2 billion. But to create at least a credible air defense that the state is willing to and wants to and will try its best to defend its citizens when their sovereignty is called into question or their lives are called into question. The United States would have to be a part and parcel of offering a horizon for that. The final issues are, and I know I've gone a little bit over my time, sorry. The final issues are recognizing how the long-term threats that are perceived by Lebanese, not just Hezbollah, vis-a-vis Israel, are seen as reasonable. They perhaps are not reasonable to us or perhaps not reasonable to outsiders, but these three threats, and there's a lot that we can do on these three threats, that Nasrallah and others constantly hit on, and that Aoun hits on, and indeed March 14th sometimes hits on in their better days, are threats centering on water, on the actions of non-state actors, and the third is this boogeyman of some kind of future transfer of Palestinians should the peace process collapse. Now, there's a lot to say on all that. We can get to that in the discussion, but I just want to leave you with one thought on trying to understand Hezbollah as a sort of, as having reason or rationality at the core of its strength. Nasrallah, about a year and a half ago, gave a speech where he went into global warming, and he talked about the ozone layers degradation and what that would mean vis-a-vis international law, history, the conflict, reminding people, Lebanese, that Sharon almost went to war with Lebanon in 2002 over an 8-inch pipe on the Wazani River in South Lebanon. This is, this goes beyond the way that U.S. officials have tended to see Hezbollah as a kind of crazy, irrational Iranian, Syrian proxy. That is not the case. And if we're going to design a better policy, we need to understand where Hezbollah's limitations lie and where the possibility for peacemaking lie. So I'll close with that. There are two other points of kind of expanding U.S. engagement and also a final point which Bilal and I sort of disagree on, which is that the United States needs to finally end its connivance and its tacit acceptance at times with the confessional structure in Lebanon, and that there exists within Lebanon itself a Lebanese determination that the confessional system tends toward violence, instability. The Lebanese themselves have said, we need a roadmap out of this. They've even tentatively mapped out important areas or important ideas for that roadmap in the Ta'if and then in the Constitution. I think President Sleiman is well positioned, if the U.S. would get behind this issue, to launch this dialogue. I think in Lebanon there's the possibility of a grand bargain of sorts within Lebanon, which would look something like expanding political enfranchisement for Shiites particularly, but for all citizens. Expanding political power for Shiites. Shiites can't be prime minister, can't be commander of the army, can't be head of the central bank, etc. In exchange for the fact that Shiites can't have their own private army. And I think that that grand bargain with these other steps represents perhaps the best sort of shift in thinking that I think is necessary in the immediate term. So thank you. I'm sorry I went over. I obviously have a tendency to do that.
I'm going to thank you, Nick, for that very broad, ranging presentation, including an overtime 100-second grand bargain on reforming the confessional structure in Lebanon. I want to hand over to you, Mona. We've heard Nick. He's talked about how you do it from within Lebanon, the bleeding wounds, what you do with the LAF, strengthening the LAF, which is something you've actually written and talked about in the past. But you've also very much looked at things in a regional context, and I'd be interested in hearing how far you think one can go by addressing the inside stuff, which Nick focused on, how much you think we have to look at the outside. You've written about the need to engage Syria, but you've also written that Syria and the US have few overlapping interests in Lebanon. You also spent time as a Fulbright scholar in Syria, I believe. So I want to hear those aspects from you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon. Thanks, Daniel. Let me first commend Nicholas on what I think is an excellent paper, one that clearly he's put a lot of work into, and it injects a lot of nuance into the discussion on Lebanon, something that I think is often missing, and yet critical when we consider a place of such deep complexity. So I congratulate you on a terrific paper. In fact, my differences with Nicholas are not significant. They really are ones of emphasis and perhaps a little bit nuance here and there. The key difference, though, would be this issue of external players versus resolving the situation in Lebanon or deriving a Lebanon-centric policy. I think that in the ideal world, frankly, for Lebanon, it would be terrific if Lebanon was no longer an arena for proxies to play out their various power struggles. And that ultimately, I hope that's where Lebanon ends up, and ideally we want a policy that would reflect that. But it's my sense, understanding your, maybe despair is too strong a word, but your pessimism as to how far any kind of dialogue, rapprochement with Syria or some kind of opening with Iran might go, it's my sense that we neglect that angle at Lebanon's peril, actually, and that there are important opportunities that might be missed if we don't, we in the United States and other regional actors don't take advantage of some of the shifts that I would argue are already taking place on the ground. And indeed, as Daniel has noted, putting my cards on the table, I've written a paper arguing for the need to engage with Syria on a number of issues, but Lebanon certainly being one of them. Let me talk just briefly, because I want to keep my remarks short, on the internal issues. And here, again, I really commend you, Nicholas, because I think you have, in great detail in your paper, started to tease apart some of these complexities and are advocating, I think, what would be a very controversial, no doubt, policy, but one that I think seeks to understand Lebanon on its terms. And I think that is, frankly, critical to moving the ball forward and moving Lebanon more on a path of lasting peace and stability. Just a couple of, maybe, I don't even know if quibbles are the word, and I did go through your paper, and you didn't raise it here, but I would lay out, I think, as we think about Hezbollah, we need to understand Hezbollah in the context of what happened this past May. And I think in your paper, you rightly point out some of the shifts. I would perhaps place greater emphasis on what has happened to Hezbollah, to its reputation, to its popular standing for having turned its arms, as it said it never would, on fellow Lebanese. And essentially this sort of myth of resistance on some level, I think, has been shattered. And it's important to understand what that means, what the potential for greater sectarian violence in Lebanon might be in the wake of what happened this past May. I would argue that we're still dealing with the fallout from that, and will for some time to come. I very much agree with your bleeding wounds argument, and I would agree with you it's a no-brainer, and frankly those kinds of measures should be taken on their own merit, and I would think would help inject greater stability in a region that right now is quite volatile. I'm not so sure, though, that that tactic, coupled with strengthening of the LAF, will do the trick. And I know you're not arguing that those things alone will. I guess what I'm saying, and I'm in a way playing devil's advocate because I feel I need to keep this somewhat interesting, is that there are those who will push back hard and say, who is to say that Hezbollah is not simply going to pocket those concessions, use those concessions to further aggrandize themselves in the Lebanese arena, and then simply ask for more and more and more. And you raise the specter later in your paper of the boogie that all Lebanese share of forced expulsions of Palestinians from Israel into Lebanon, and essentially the notion that Hezbollah can simply continue to move the goalpost. And so I would just push back a little bit on your response to that and how they deal with that. I want to commend you and frankly underscore your notion of trying to provide a more nuanced understanding of Hezbollah. I think one of the reasons that our policy toward Lebanon has been so unimaginative is because we are very much trapped by our own notion of what Hezbollah is. And I think good policy has to rest on good analysis, and that it's essential moving forward that that we develop a more nuanced understanding of this movement. I think it's an assumption that its role as the resistance and its accompanying insistence on the sanctity of preserving its arsenal are on some level immutable. I'm heartened to hear you talk about trying to sketch out and think about ways in which one could see a roadmap toward integration of Hezbollah's arms. And I think that, frankly, the jury is still very much out. I don't think any of us have a definitive answer on the nature of Hezbollah and how it can or could, down the road, evolve, whether it could indeed become a political actor among other political actors in the Lebanese arena. Under what conditions might this happen? How would the environment need to change? And obviously, coming from a U.S. perspective, how does U.S. policy interact with this? In what ways have we potentially obstructed that path toward integration? In what ways down the road could we perhaps accelerate a path toward political integration? Let me turn briefly back to this question of regional dynamics, since Daniel had asked, and I certainly would point out, I think the area that we need to think about most with respect to regional actors is Syria, and the role that Syria could play. To my mind, it's very difficult to think about anchoring peace and stability in Lebanon without some understanding of how to deal with Syria, given its long-term, as you know, long-term role in Syria, its essential hegemony in that country for nearly 30 years. And I think it's not as distant a prospect. The role of Syria, of negotiating and engaging with Syria, is not as distant a prospect as I picked up from your paper. I would first point out that things are already happening. There are indirect discussions already between Syria and Israel. There are direct discussions and developments that have occurred between Syria and Lebanon. And there's, of course, perhaps with a new administration in being inaugurated in January, the potential for movement on a U.S.-Syria track. So I think that negotiations are far more of a realizable goal than you might indicate. Secondly, I think, unfortunately, what's happened, at least in Washington, is somehow engaging with Syria has become equated with selling Lebanese sovereignty down the river. And I think it's really important to point out that that is by no means the case, or doesn't have to be. I can understand from our Lebanese friends' point of view their fears, given, frankly, past U.S. policy. But I also believe that it is not only possible but essential to engage with Syria and to figure out ways in which Lebanese sovereignty can be very much preserved, respected, but also that there is an understanding that certainly Syria has a long-standing interest in what happens in Lebanon and, frankly, vice versa, and this is even enshrined in the Ta'if Agreement. Nonetheless, I think it's always important that we be clear that we are not looking to engage with Syria in order to sacrifice Lebanese sovereignty. I would simply say that I think efforts to stabilize Lebanon will be more successful if Syria, which is a principal stakeholder in this, is engaged in discussions. And third, I would point to what's already taken place between Syria and Lebanon, the establishment of diplomatic relations, a first in their history. I believe embassies are to be opened this month. You might know better than I if that's actually on track. There's discussion of moving forward on border demarcation, where I think clearly the rubber meets the road, if in fact it happens and how it happens and so forth. There's great skepticism about what these moves mean. I completely endorse that skepticism. However, I do think it's important for us to seize on these changes to the extent that we can, to see whether there's space and possibilities for leveraging them into real movement. I think to ignore those things or discount them entirely, we end up losing valuable opportunities perhaps down the road. I'm going to just conclude, if I could, with just 3 quick points on implications for U.S. policy. And I would agree with you that to put Lebanon on a more stable path, we need dramatic change, or almost a paradigm shift in how we deal with Lebanon. Simply muddling through over the next 4 years or 8 years or for however long, I think is simply not going to do it. First, I think the U.S. has to recognize and acknowledge Lebanon's political and demographic realities. This includes acknowledging the political underrepresentation of Lebanon's sizable Shiite community. And again, I have no illusions about Hezbollah. I'm not at all trying to romanticize their role. But one has to acknowledge they are the most powerful force in the Shia community, if not in Lebanon writ large. And I think we need to understand and acknowledge that reality. Secondly, I would advocate for a U.S. policy in Lebanon in which we try to remain above the fray. Our policies of supporting one side against another in Lebanon's fractious political scene has not yielded intended results. And I think you could probably go into great detail about what's happened with March 14th over the past few years. But that essentially, history has shown that when the United States tries to come in on one side or another in Lebanon, inevitably we end up not succeeding and not producing the kinds of results we're looking for. And third, I think here's again a question of emphasis. I would perhaps put greater emphasis than you have on the importance of institution building and strengthening the state in Lebanon, as well as on national dialogue and political reconciliation. I know that you've discussed it, but I think it deserves, it's right up there, frankly, with reforming and strengthening the armed forces as one key institution of the state, but others as well, I think, need to be recognized, and that essentially I think we have to understand, and I'll conclude on this point, that Hezbollah really has sort of thrived on the weakness of the Lebanese state, and that the extent to which there is a stronger Lebanese state, strong institutions, and that we hopefully have some expertise in this and can provide assistance in this way, I think is to Lebanon's good. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Noel. So you can keep that there. Bilal, obviously we've been looking at both the internal, the external. You've thought a lot about US policy towards Hezbollah. We've heard Mona say, try and stay above the fray. We've talked about the bleeding wounds. We've heard Mona also say the importance of having a more nuanced understanding of Hezbollah, also with an appreciation that perhaps this is Oliver Twist. Even when one deals with the bleeding wounds, there is more. You have suggested that an Obama administration will devote less time and energy, by definition, because of the other things on its plate, to Lebanon, and have talked about muddling through and how one might insulate Lebanon from developments in the region. I wonder if you could, off the back of what Nick has said, off the back of what Mona has said, given your own assessment and perhaps your own thinking on how May's events have affected Hezbollah, talk to us a bit about US policy towards Hezbollah, both the internal and the external part of it.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I owe special debt of gratitude for Michael and Daniel. Nick, thank you so much for coming here today. Mona as well. I'll start with a confession. I haven't had a chance to read the paper.
I've been sick for 3 days.
5 days. But I do look forward to reading it. I'm sure it's good. Not only because you quote me, but because I know of your work, and it's definitely solid. Let me just correct you on one quote about what I have said, which is that the Syria-Israel track will have basically direct implications on Hezbollah's disarmament. As a matter of fact, my only argument is that it is not that relevant. It will not have direct implications with Hezbollah's military arsenal. The only thing that is going to matter is serious breakthroughs on the U.S.-Iran bilateral relationships. And I'll make that argument in my presentation. Let's face it. Any discussion on U.S. policy or assessment of U.S. Lebanese bilateral relationship that is not going to mention Hezbollah is just going nowhere. This is an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and if you're going to miss it, avoid it, or wish it away, this is just not very smart. I'm dividing my talk as follows. I'll define what Hezbollah is. I'll explain the challenges it poses to the United States, and I'll make a few remarks on what Washington can do about it. Let me start with sources because I think it's important, and I'll put my cards on the table after that. My views and analysis on Hezbollah have been informed by a number of things. I'll start with the more important. For the past 8 years or so, I've had direct access to Hezbollah from foot soldier to highest leadership. And highest leadership, I mean the Secretary General. I'm not only a Lebanese citizen, but I am someone who is from the south. I come from a small village called Yaroun in the south. It's an absolutely gorgeous village. I have awful and fond memories from that place. Awful during the Israeli occupation from 82 to 2000. Lebanese have had to endure awful treatment by the southern Lebanese army at that infamous checkpoint of Beit Yahon, which I vividly remember. The Israelis were too smart to actually deal directly with the population. They just left the nasty stuff with the SLA. Fond memories because, I did things that, like playing soccer from dusk till dawn, eating good food, hanging out with family, climbing the highest mountain in the village that overlooks the Israeli towns of Baram, Avivim, and see if I can remember them, Dovev and Yiron, and just really contemplate. I didn't need any, goggles or anything. It was really very close. I mean, this is right along the Israeli-Lebanese borders, and I could see the beautiful kibbutzes, on the other side, and very clearly because the electricity was always there, and we never had electricity. I'll definitely blame the Lebanese government. Bottom line, since the liberation of southern Lebanon, in 2000, I've had a front row seat as far as watching Hezbollah in action, both in the south and in Beirut, where I was born and raised. This is as far as sources. Cards on the table. I'm strongly in favor of a better, stronger, and more transparent relationship with the United States. Let's be honest. There's some people in Lebanon who want nothing to do with the United States. The fundamentals, I believe, are there. The Lebanese and Americans share a lot of values and norms. We are talking about a country that has never experienced authoritarian or dictatorial rule. It's always been ruled along democratic lines, no matter how dysfunctional the political system is. It respects international law, and it has never been a threat to anybody. Its economy is market-oriented to the max in a very bizarre way. Its private and banking sector has always been strong. Society is open-minded, it's open, it's well-educated, it's entrepreneurial, and its people have always had a good view of America as a country and as society. Not to mention, of course, that Lebanese excel abroad, especially in this country. Now, this affinity towards America includes the Shia community. At the end of the day, the economic fortunes of the Shia community heavily rely on the remittances of the Shia in the United States and in other places. And even Hassan Nasrallah knows that. So bottom line, nothing can prevent these two countries from having a much better and more productive relationship. The bottom line, how do you get there and how to make it work? There are a few real issues that need to be solved or at least managed, and that's the relationship or lack of between Hezbollah and the United States, and this is the subject of my talk. So what is Hezbollah? And this is, like Mona said, this is really a fundamental question. I think we if we come up with a good answer on that one, it will make life so much easier as far as policy. More than two decades since its emergence, we still struggle to understand what Hezbollah really stands for. I mean, multiple concepts have been proposed. One, this is an anti-Western organization that will never seek accommodation with the Western world. Two, this is a Syrian and Iranian proxy that is involved in a regional power struggle against the US and its allies. And three, this is a local group that strives to protect its interests and the interests of its constituency, the Shia, through a number of means. Political integration, superstate alliances, military buildup, and political participation. So, but what complicates things is that Hezbollah could be, all these things at the same time. And that's why we call it Janus-faced. Now, but the picture I've been able to draw of that organization is a little bit more controversial. And please keep in mind this is a work in progress. It's, I don't claim to have the absolute truth as far as Hezbollah, but it's a thinking process, and I'm more than looking forward to know your views on this, as I've written in a recent journal article on Middle East policy, the Journal of Middle East Policy. And here's, this is the picture I've been able to gather on that organization. This is first and foremost a local Lebanese Shia Islamist group, and every single word counts. And its raison d'etre is to pursue its goal of establishing an Islamic order in Lebanon. How, sometimes by force, sometimes by persuasion, according to the circumstances. All the concepts I mentioned earlier, they're right. I mean, they're not wrong. But again, they don't define the true nature of the party. And they certainly don't shed enough light on the long-term objectives of this organization. I really want to get to the bottom of what do these guys really want? At the end of the day, what is their ultimate objective? So I invite you to read that article, and I really look forward to any comments that you have. And I make my case why, Hezbollah is a local group that has a local objective, and it has a number of means to reach that objective. So for now, let's stick to that thesis, that this is a local group whose goals are local, and has many means to meet those goals. Now, let's define the challenge that this organization poses to the United States. Now, is it a group that has a global terrorist potential? Is it, its ability to undermine U.S. interests in Lebanon and the region? Or is it its military buildup and uncompromising posture vis-a-vis Israel, America's #1 ally in the Middle East? I think a strong case could be made, any reasonably objective person could make the case that, it's the latter. It's the military arsenal, and it's the uncompromising posture toward Israel. Now, it doesn't mean that Hezbollah has no global terrorist potential. No, it has. But that's another discussion. Doesn't mean that it's not able to undermine U.S. interests in Lebanon. It can. But let's be honest, the priority is how to deal with this massive military arsenal. And the group's disarmament. So my conclusion is that the answer to Hezbollah's military challenge lies neither in Damascus, Nick, nor in Beirut, but it's actually in Tehran, specifically in the office of Ayatollah Khamenei. Unlike Al-Qaeda's terrorism, there's a clear address regarding Hezbollah's arms. Khamenei does not hold a monopoly over authority in the Islamic Republic, but he remains the locus of executive decision-making, particularly on issues of strategic and ideological importance, including Hezbollah. Now, contrary to some analysis, and I include yours, Nick, comprehensive peace in the Middle East should not be viewed as a precondition for disarming Hezbollah. Indeed, Hezbollah's weapons have always been linked unnecessarily to many developments in the region, most notably Israeli-Syrian negotiations, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Arab-Israeli peace in general. There's no doubt that Hezbollah is involved in regional politics, specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian theater. But this is mostly at the behest of Iran, because Iran asks it to do that. Hezbollah allows Iran to defy borders clearly and project its power into the Levant and influence events there. Now, again, not to suggest that Hezbollah takes orders grudgingly from Iran or has no interest in engaging in regional politics. The group unreservedly follows Iran's supreme leader and generally trusts him to, take after its best take after its best interests. Sorry. So if we were to define that relationship, it's not a patron-client relationship. It is more like a father-son relationship. One trusts the other, obviously. Now, liberating Jerusalem and continuing the armed struggle against the Jewish state are ideals that Hezbollah really strongly believes in. But they are, in my opinion, unrealistic distractions. Hezbollah longs for the day when the Palestinians regain their rights, Israel ceases to exist, but the establishment of an Islamic order in Lebanon is exactly what it looks for. The issue of Hezbollah's military arsenal can only be resolved, that's my judgment, in the context of a broader deal between the United States and Iran. That's it. Through direct bilateral negotiations. So as such, a big deal, grand bargain, or whatever my colleagues at Brookings or even people here at New America, including Flint, have talked about, the grand bargain between the United States and Iran is guaranteed to put the issue of Hezbollah's weapons on the table. And only that will do it. Okay, fine. But this is like saying, the United States is going to solve its energy crisis by inventing cold fusion, right? I mean, it's simply unrealistic. You start with a small problem and then you end up with a bigger problem. How do you engage the Iranians, right? The difficulties and the costs and benefits of U.S. engagement with Iran is something that, Iran experts, including my friend and colleague Suzanne Maloney, have analyzed in great detail. So I'm not going to do that today. And I like Suzanne's analysis a lot, so I urge you to read it. But I want to stress on, again, is that it's only the Islamic Republic. It's the only actor that's capable of instructing Hezbollah to end its armed struggle against Israel once and for all, and to shift its focus to the Lebanese political process. Now, the question is obviously at what price would Iran be willing to cooperate on Hezbollah, and what if it's not interested in cooperating? I'm just going to be a little bit pessimistic and assume that the United States and Iran are not going to be able to start a diplomatic process anytime soon that would resolve their major differences, right? So the question is, what can be done today, about the weapons, right? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Hezbollah is a major strategic ally and asset for Iran, but instead of striving for the absolutist goal of disarming the organization, which merely enhances the group's bunker mentality and aggravates the existing sectarian and political polarization in Lebanon, the United States can try to mitigate the most pressing effects, right, mitigate the effects of the most pressing challenge posed by Hezbollah, and that's, again, the military arsenal. So let's be realistic. The United States could try to limit the long-range weapons supply from Iran and Syria to Hezbollah by enforcing, with the help of its allies, friends probably, I'm not sure, a stricter UN monitoring regime, so in accordance with 1701, obviously, in southern Lebanon. Now, is it going to work? I have no idea. I really am doubtful. So, bottom line in conclusion, the process of transforming Hezbollah into a normal political party, right, unarmed, has two very separate stages. The first requires Iran's cooperation, like I said, so instructing the party to end the armed struggle against Israel. And once these weapons are rendered obsolete, then the Lebanese politicians will be able to enter into negotiations with the party and try to come up with a deal on what is the exact nature of the integration of the party and its constituencies into the Lebanese political system. But first, it's Iran. I mean, there's no doubt. Yeah, I have no doubt in my mind that Hezbollah's future role as an armed force will be determined by Iran, as long as Tehran sees value in Hezbollah's deterrent power against Israel and the United States. The Party of God will continue to exist as an armed entity, irrespective of regional developments. The fact that Hezbollah has a central place in Iran's regional calculations and broader foreign policy agenda, ironically, works against the realization of its local dream, which I've just talked about, which is the establishment of an Islamic order in Lebanon. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bilal. Well, and I really would. First of all, for getting out of your sickbed, and also for sharing your thoughts of a work in progress. We always prefer to have people who have absolute truth, so hopefully next time you have one. No, I appreciate that. I want to give Nick 2 minutes to come back, and then I think, does Brian or Ben have the, if you want to take the mic, and then we'll take a few questions at once because we've left less time than I would like. Nick.
Let me just say the sort of two most important points. One is that Bilal and I do fundamentally disagree on this. I don't think it's an Iran-only option that exists as essentially our best way forward of integrating Hezbollah. The important thing here is that the CIA you have to consider the relationship with Iran. I think it's far more nuanced than Bilal says. Actually, the CIA director 2-3 months ago in front of Congress described the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah as one between a junior and senior partner. It's not a marionette theater. And that's fundamentally different from what Bilal just said about a father-son relationship. And it's interesting to consider that Nasrallah last year said something that he'd never said before, which is he said, Hezbollah at this point determines Iran's foreign policy more than Iran determines Hezbollah's foreign policy. Now, I think that's part and parcel of a whole shift in Hezbollah's thinking and aspirations after the July 2006 war that we can talk about. The point is Hezbollah, if they want to liberate Jerusalem or create an Islamic State in Lebanon, let's say that that is their goals. I actually would fundamentally disagree with that. I think there are a lot of differences, there are a lot of wedges, etc. But let's assume that is true. Nevertheless, they are limited in what they can do by these political circles that they are surrounded by. So even if they want to go liberate Jerusalem or create an Islamic State in Lebanon, there are multiple limitations that a smarter U.S. policy, U.S.-led policy, could tap into. In order to force this issue, I think you could force it peacefully. So that's what I would want people to keep in mind. The last point is moving the goalposts, which I think is a critical issue, because that seems to me to be one of the fundamental problems in how especially U.S. policymakers think about Lebanon. Again, it all goes to Hezbollah's political limitations. Of course they can move the goalposts. They can keep on saying, no, it's actually the 7 villages in the south. That's also occupied territory. The problem is that each time they move those goalposts, their political circles get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right.
And Hezbollah itself has said that when that happens, they are greatly constrained. And indeed, to use force, they would be disastrous in Lebanon. Sorry, go on.
Right, hold your thoughts, Bilal. Integrate your response into the responses to the questioners. There's several things I'd like to throw out to the panel. I'm going to mention a couple, but I'm not going to turn over to you. I'm going to let those also percolate in your heads while we listen to other people. I want to thank my colleague at the Century Foundation, Michael Hanna, who really was the moving force behind putting today's event together and has escorted the writing of Nick's paper and brought these panelists together. One thing that didn't come up at all, which was fascinating for me, and I think if we had been meeting 24 months ago would have, is the UN Tribunal. No one mentioned it. Is that a dead issue? Bilal, when I have a partly similar response to Nick, which is how much can that message of the Islamist order and the broader struggle and the need to retain a militia resonate in the domestic constituency and in the non-Shia constituencies with whom Hezbollah is in alliance, absent the bleeding wounds. And the other thing that was in my head as you were speaking was, if you do get, and I think it's very difficult to get, a change in the predisposition of Syria, how easy is it to get arms in if you have Syrian non-cooperation, active Syrian non-cooperation? And when you were speaking, Mona, I was fascinated to think what the paradigm shift that recognizes the political domestic demographic realities in Lebanon, what that would look like and how one does the stronger state institution building. But I'm not going to hand those over. I'm going to ask people to, cluster the questions in at least threes. Ben here is going to go round, introduce yourself, ask your question, keep it short, and we'll start with the gentleman here.
Thank you, Daniel. Hussein Abdel-Hussein. I have a question to Nick. It seems you're talking about two things on Hezbollah. The first thing is that...
And if people have an institutional or something affiliation, just mention that as well.
Okay, I'm a correspondent with the Rai newspaper.
And Chatham House.
And a visiting fellow with Chatham House. Thank you. You're saying two things. You're saying that Hezbollah is most powerful, whereas the March 14 coalition has no strength on the ground. On the other hand, you're saying it's not a crazy party. And I'm just going. I just want to learn what you think about. We know that Hezbollah blocked the parliament for more than a year. They insisted on the election of a consensus president, even though many issues remain without consensus, including Hezbollah's arm. Hezbollah started what is called a preemptive war with Israel. Hezbollah stormed the streets of Beirut and Mount Lebanon, burned down a newspaper and a TV. And Hezbollah pulled out its ministers when everyone was trying to vote on a tribunal. So it seems to me it's a crazy party. It calls itself a party of God. My question is,
am I right or not?
No.
Oh, okay.
if Washington talks to Hezbollah, do you think this sends a message that get a bigger stick and we'll talk to you? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
No. We're collecting questions. Otherwise, we won't have time. Sorry.
Collecting questions gets dangerous. Okay.
I think the most important...
And introduce yourself. Sorry.
My name is Rula Telj. I'm a political analyst, freelancer. I think that the most important part that was not discussed today was the Salafist movement in Lebanon and the growth of these movements in the last 4 years. And I think from my viewpoint, this gave another excuse for Hezbollah to strengthen itself militarily, and then like the raison d'être is not only fighting Israel, but it is also protecting itself and its community from the growing movements within the camps. And I do believe that what Nick said about the cards of Hezbollah being held not only by Iran, but also by Syria. I think, like once the peace process goes forward and if any peace agreement is to be signed, I don't think Hezbollah would find enough legitimacy within its own community, even within the Shia community in the south. They would not have the same legitimacy. So I think it is a concern. It is a big concern for the U.S. Hezbollah obviously is a big concern, but I would like us to think more about the Salafist and whoever is behind them and whoever is like, what's the agenda behind those groups.
And I'm going to take the gentleman next to you, and then.
Yeah, I'm Ghassan Shubli from the RAND Corporation. Actually, I totally agree with her that there is a new equation, the Salafist one. So I don't know if Hezbollah would disarm, and even like if Iran forced Hezbollah to do it. I don't think there's Hezbollah's interest in the question. Now, I want to point to something that Muna said, that here we need to define more.
Yeah, we keep it short.
Yeah, we need to define about what is Hezbollah, like the terrorist organization. Something we don't understand is how deep is their nationalist resistance and ideology, nationalist ideology embedded in Hezbollah. We cannot qualify how important it is, and so we need to understand this here first before taking any decision. So that's the point. And regarding Nick's and Bilal's kind of counter-argument on Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, like to whom they rely to, I want to add that Hezbollah has become more and more independent from Iran. They are receiving more and more money coming from Shia all over the world, from diaspora. They have developed businesses.
And the question.
Yeah. No, it's just like comments. So I want to ask.
Okay, fine.
It's just like adding some comments about this, like the importance of resistance.
In that case, we'll grab a last question if it's a brief one from right in front of you here.
I'm David Kenner with the Foreign Policy Magazine. Nick, you mentioned the boogeyman of sort of Palestinian naturalization, and sure, demagogues about it, but it's a legitimate problem, I think, to some degree, because, I mean, a right of return in any Palestinian, or any Israeli-Palestinian deal, it doesn't seem likely that it will have any right of return. And so these Palestinians are going to be here. Is there any thinking that's being done about what to do in the event that this occurs, that Lebanon has to deal with Palestinians who can't go home?
So, I think some of the other missing things that didn't come up, the whole Palestinian situation in Lebanon, Salafist groups, where they meet actually in the northern area in Tripoli, in Nahar al-Bared, resistance, nationalists, crazies. If you're up for it, Bilal, I thought I'd let you start.
With the Salafists?
With whichever of that. Choose which questions you want to address.
Pick a winner. I don't think I have anything smart to say about the tribunal, so I'll leave that to Mona, seriously. The Salafists, who's behind them? That's a very controversial story, you know that. I've written recently an article for the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, trying to figure out where these guys come from and who's financing them and what is their future. My own analysis of this is that the two theses that have been proposed so far are not mutually exclusive, and I'll tell you which two theses I'm talking about. One is that is proposed by the pro-Syrian alliance that includes Hezbollah now, and is that these guys are basically financed by some Sunni politicians in Lebanon and some regional actors, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt. The anti-Syrian coalition basically says that, which one's that?
March 14.
March 14 basically says that these guys are more imaginary than real. They're actually a threat that Damascus has created, and more specifically the Syrian intelligence services. There's really truth in both theses, but my argument is that they're not mutually exclusive. What I focus on is the common denominator, which is the Lebanonization of the Salafist jihadist movement. I mean, if we were to miss the point that we actually have a really serious problem as far as a radicalization current in Lebanon, that has major consequences. So where do they come from? My own analysis is that most of them actually come from Iraq. It's a spillover effect from the Iraqi conflict. Mm-hmm. How do they cross the border? Of course, the Syrians have let them done that with Syrian acquiescence, and they've turned a blind eye to that because that serves their interests.
Some came through the airport.
Oh, I'm sure that's also the case. I don't have the perfect intelligence on that. But more broadly, again, I don't particularly advocate one thesis against the other. I really don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I urge you to read that article. Hezbollah's finances, Shibli, Hassan, you're absolutely right. I've never argued in my articles or my talk today that Iran completely controls Hezbollah. That's not the case. I actually specifically analyzed the organizational structure of Hezbollah and what is local about it and what is not local about it. And I'll tell you what is not local. The not local stuff is the stuff that has to do with military decisions. This is where Iran is completely in control. What it has to do with political participation and decisions that it makes, whether to put in like 2 ministers or 1 minister in the cabinet, of course Iran is not going to have a decision in that. They really actually trust the Secretary General. So look at the organizational structure and who makes decisions and who doesn't make decisions. As far as finances, you're absolutely right. The money that they have, that they receive from abroad, is not a number 1 source, but a number 2 source. Number 1 source, I still believe it's Iran. It's a major supplier. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they get a lot of money, and I've said that, from the United States and other places. I still stick to the thesis that this is a father-son relationship because they really both trust each other. And I look at the Constitution, I look at the ideology, and I look at the behavior. So that pretty much covers both theory and practice.
What?
Just very quickly, let me maybe add 1 cent on the question of the Salafists, and I think you're absolutely right to note that. My sense is that we're in the midst of a changing dynamic in Lebanon, and a very dangerous one. And in particular, I would note the events of this past May as the most stark example of what can happen, and the fact that there, I think, are very real concerns about deepening sectarianism in Lebanon, a feature, by the way, that had not been present during the Civil War, that is the Sunni-Shia violence. And so I think that Hezbollah is very much part of a broader dynamic, and I think Nick's notion of concentric circles of constraint is a very important way of thinking about it. So too with Iran, and here again I also disagree a bit with Bilal, though you've sort of amended your comments a little bit or restated your comments perhaps in a different way. I certainly detected and would say that I don't agree that Iran has quite the degree of influence and control. Again, from my perspective, we're talking about a situation that is continually evolving, and that frankly,
much like a father-son relationship would do.
Indeed, on some level, perhaps. I don't know if
partnership.
But I think that who has more influence? I think Hezbollah's influence is growing, certainly at Syria's expense, and I would argue at Iran's as well. I'm not an Iran expert, but I do think that, quite frankly, Iran's own economic dire straits is yet another factor to consider in its frankly, limitations on how much it can continue to funnel to Hezbollah. This is starting to become an issue within Iran. And then with respect to the tribunal, I think, there's now talk that it will actually get underway in March. Who knows? I don't think it is the ticking time bomb that's going to blow up the Syrian regime that some have thought it might be.
I promised Bilal that as he was passing the microphone, he could speak into it.
Just a very quick comment. Again, on the long-term objective of establishing an Islamic order, I never said it was easy, or that actually even the Shia community wants it. But this is what Hezbollah wants, and this is its major dilemma. This is absolutely its major dilemma. The International Crisis Group once called Hezbollah a rebel without a cause, but for a different reason. I actually stick to that concept, but I would extend it a little bit further, which is, okay, here's what we want to do, but neither our constituency nor can it work in Lebanon, so what do we do about it? I think really they have a major dilemma, and they're thinking hard about it every single day. But I'm telling you what they believe in, and in practice, given the structural problems with the political system and the preferences of the Shia community, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But they have tried to do it, given if you look at history, and they have imposed Islamic order in areas that they have controlled when they first started in the 80s, and when they were a much more aggressive and revolutionary movement. Now they've toned it down, obviously. They've made tactical...
I think your microphone passing tax time.
They've made tactical adjustments,
Just
but
expired.
not strategic, sorry.
Brief from Nick, because I want to go back. We're losing our
Let's
audience.
do rapid fire sort of response to some of the things that are out there. First of all, it's interesting to consider in 2005, Hezbollah, when they decided for the first time ever to join the government, the cabinet, they actually sought a Lebanese fatwa, not an Iranian fatwa. And I think there are a lot of Lebanese commentators that have spoken about this. It's a very important, subtle but important indicator of Hezbollah's changing relationship with Iran. And let's also remember that Fadlallah vehemently criticized Hezbollah for issuing its own fatwa saying that Shiites should vote for Hezbollah, which is something interesting to consider when you consider Hezbollah's stance on an Islamic republic. Or on the issue of Wilayat al-Faqih in Iran. This is actually the source, I believe, of there are important differences within the high-ranking leadership of Hezbollah. And we've seen this spill over in public, especially between Fadlallah, adherents of Fadlallah's line, including some of the parliamentary members, Sheikh Naim Qasim, etc. So it's much more complicated. David, in response to your points, the boogeyman of future transfer is less about naturalizing the Palestinians in Lebanon than if the peace process falls apart. Israel is going to be forced to confront its demographic time bomb, and they're going to get rid of Palestinians, either from the occupied territories or from Israel proper. And Hezbollah makes the argument that they're not going to go to Egypt. They're not going to go to Jordan with their peace treaties. They're not going to go to Syria with their chemical weapons. They're going to go to Lebanon. And they have made a case based on their reading of history, and to some people that's compelling. So that's actually the more important issue that I wanted to focus on. If we talk about right of return, we'll be here all night. Last sort of two comments are understanding Hezbollah. I actually, when I say understanding Hezbollah, I'm actually not as interested in understanding their motivations, their core aims. Do they want to liberate Jerusalem? Do they want an Islamic state? I actually think that's of very secondary importance. That's why I don't think necessarily a strategy of engagement with Hezbollah is the right one. I don't actually think we have to understand what is Hezbollah's true nature. I think we have to understand Hezbollah's political limitations in Lebanon, and also how they view their political limitations. That's the key to defining a strategy within Lebanon, a peaceful roadmap for sublimating their arms. The last thing is in relation to what you said. I don't think that the opposition and Hezbollah's strength on the ground is all, and March 14th is nothing. I think that Mona raised an important point, which I think lends greater weight to the strategies that I'm talking about in the paper, which is their use of arms internally in May. What one has to realize is that even though there's an opportunity for U.S. policymakers to exploit that, let's say, and to build up the other side's power, if indeed that's what we want to do, I'm not entirely convinced, one has to consider, you laid out this narrative of Hezbollah being crazy, right? They did all these things that are crazy. Why, if that's the case, are they about to potentially win the elections? Now, one can make arguments about them bearing arms and all these sorts of other things, but if you look at polling, even from pro-March 14th groups, you don't get to an endpoint of, people shouldn't be supporting them. they shouldn't be supporting. Aoun should not be as popular as he is, though diminished, of course. They shouldn't be the kind of vitriol towards March 14th leaders.
I'm not going to let this turn into a dialogue because there's lots of...
In any case,
I'm going to ask you to close there. I'm going to take another round of questions. We'll try and squeeze as many in, but also be respectful of that that many of you have to leave. So, I think we've only got one question. Excellent. Okay, we've got two. Please.
Yes, Joyce Karam with the Al Hayat newspaper. Hi, Bilal. Hi, Mona. Hi, Nick. I'm surprised I didn't hear much from you. I know Daniel was very strict with the time, but on the Saudi-Syrian relationship, I mean, it seems it was the turn point of the events in Lebanon when this relationship just, you know, went through the wall, and absent of any, you know, change of dynamic in this relationship, how can really things change in Lebanon? And Mona, perhaps you can. I'm very interested in the, you know, the increasing Sunni-Shia divide in the country, and given this relationship, I mean, how realistic to see things changing in Lebanon without a change in this?
Great question. I'm going to let my colleagues Michael here and Josh here ask quick questions. And
very quickly, but one point that wasn't touched upon seriously, but if we were to pursue a paradigmatic shift that would include an enhanced deterrent capacity for the Lebanese armed forces, obviously a big consideration is Israeli reaction. Is it really feasible to imagine that Israel would go along with this when the broader regional dimensions have not been solved or at least tamped down?
Great. Someone looking out for the Israeli interest when I'm up here on the thing and can't ask questions. Thank you.
Just real briefly, Mona, you mentioned earlier about the importance of institution and state building, but that was not mentioned necessarily by the other speakers. So I was wondering exactly what that would constitute, and then why you believe that ought to be given a high priority relative to the other things that were mentioned by the other speakers. Thanks.
Great. Let's get responses and closing thoughts from all of you. Do you want to go first, Mona? Thanks, Mona.
Let me just take your question and Joyce's very quickly. In terms of my sense, as I said, I situate the notion of institution building into the idea in my head that one has to have a strong Lebanese state in order for it to be functional and not dysfunctional. That Hezbollah has essentially benefited from the dysfunction. So I'm talking about things like continuing to work on building the parliament, the electoral law reform, which unfortunately I think many are disappointed by. Working on issues related to corruption, working on issues related to service provision, places where people expect government to be. And unfortunately, in Lebanon, often the government is not. Joyce, your question is an excellent one, and I think what you point to is, again, a point that informs my analysis, which is that all of these issues are interconnected and interlinked, and therefore it's very difficult to look at Lebanon in a vacuum. The issue of essentially what one could call a Saudi-Syrian proxy battle that is continuing to be fought out in Lebanon is a very serious one. My concern is that there are tremendous unintended consequences. One has to ask how much control do either of these players on the outside really have on dynamics that are being unleashed inside Lebanon. And that then relates to the other point that I had tried to make, which is that I think Nicholas's analysis is excellent, but one has to consider it within this atmosphere of deepening sectarianism in Lebanon and what that means and how one begins to unravel and peel back the tension and hopefully begin to start anchoring Lebanon on a much more stable path. Clearly, I think it's essential that these external players also their interests, their proxy battles have to be tamped down, and the only way one can see having that happen is some sort of rapprochement between Saudi and Syria.
Can I address Michael's question?
You can do what you like.
Michael, it's an excellent question. I've been working on the U.S. military assistance file since last year, and I'll tell you what this very fine gentleman is actually arguing about. Bill Wonderly, who's a good friend of mine. He's at the Pentagon at the U.S. Office of Strategic Planning and Policy. He's in charge of the Middle East. Yes, the Israelis obviously want the qualitative military edge in the region, and they're worried about the U.S. shipments to Lebanon. But here's the idea: there's nothing sophisticated enough or high tech that is going to be sent to Lebanon that the Israelis are really, really going to worry about. There is today an ongoing dialogue between the Americans and the Israelis. Actually, the Americans trying to persuade the Israelis that it is in your own interest that the LAF is able to secure the country and fight these terrorist groups. And you can and allow the LAF to basically patrol the borders and just really secure the country. There's nothing of an offensive nature. It's really defensive. The Israelis are always worried, obviously, but I can tell you there's a really ongoing dialogue between the two right now. And I'm hoping the Americans will be able to persuade them.
Thanks, man.
This is actually a very interesting report from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy just came out, where they basically argue, you know, obviously WINEP has its own, you know, historical leanings. We could debate that for a while, but they basically say that the Israelis and the U.S. shouldn't be as concerned about Israel's qualitative military edge when it comes to the Sunni Gulf states. That, you know, we can give the Saudis and these other Gulf guys better stuff. Almost as good as we would give the Israelis because they're more or less an important wedge against Iran. He doesn't talk about Lebanon here because indeed it is more complicated as Michael suggested. What I would say though is that it is not as Bilal just said, which is, you know, the most sophisticated stuff is not going to be sent to Lebanon. Just yesterday actually the deputy foreign minister in Russia made some very interesting statements that comes on basically a cascading series of announcements since this sort of helicopter debacle in September that the U.S. mismanaged, which is basically that March 14th itself, if they retain the majority, but certainly the opposition, are going to turn east for these weapons. They're going to be supplied by Russia. China already is doing officer training. They're going to build that out. And they may indeed be supplied by Iran. I think the Iranian model of making their own sophisticated weaponry is one that Hezbollah has likely taken to heart. That's why I also suggest that even if Syria and Israel get on a peace deal, you might see Hezbollah, you know, they have the sophistication to be able to make their own weaponry, be able to last for quite some time. So those are our alternatives. So I think that's an important case to make to the Israelis as to where this thing is going. You can imagine if the Russians say we're not going to provide the most sophisticated air defense, that would really disrupt the qualitative military edge to Syria, let's say, because we don't want to disrupt the balance in the region, or Iran. I could actually see them thinking that it would be a smart step in Lebanon as part of their Eastern Mediterranean strategy, the most sophisticated air defense capabilities, potentially, given the limitations and the lack of other stuff like chemical weapons capability, etc., or a nuclear program in Iran that could really shift things. So that is where things are trending. Hariri was there in Russia, Elias Murder was there the other day. Those are our options right now. And I think if we can make a convincing case to the Israelis that Hezbollah is, in fact, very susceptible to a political strategy within Lebanon, and that, indeed, its most important base of support, the Shiites, overwhelmingly by the opposition's own polling, would prefer to see a strong Lebanese armed forces defend their country than Hezbollah. They say that according to the pro-opposition polling by Abdul Saad. You know, I mean, Naim Qasim's best friend. That's what they say. So I think that opens up a whole range of new thinking.
We're going to draw it to a close there. I mean, I would really like to thank the audience as well as the panelists, because I think what we had was an extremely well-informed panel feeding off a very, very well-informed audience. And I'm not sure there are going to be too many more serious, in-depth, broad-ranging, and such well-informed panels taking place as we're in this transition period here in Washington. I'd obviously like to thank the three of you. I learned a lot. I know that when things get when I'm lacking in conspiracy theories in terms of what's going on internally in Israel, or when the level of invective between Israeli politicians is on a lull, when we've got holidays or something, I turn to reading more of the Lebanese press, because that always has an even richer supply of internal political invective and conspiracy theory. You will follow this on a day-to-day. Nick No's paper, as I've said, is available on the way out and will be formally released towards the end of the year in about 10 days. Bilal has given you a reading list of his own writings that you will need to now go home and look up, and Mona was far too modest to do that. We've all benefited greatly from your participation. We appreciate it much. There's many things we didn't get to go into or touch on in the beginning, whether it be the Salafists the regional question in terms of the Saudi-Syrian tensions and how they play out in Lebanon, the Palestinian community in Lebanon, how the divisions and the weakness of the Christian community in a way facilitates such a depth of Sunni-Shia rivalry inside Lebanon. But I think alongside the things we didn't get enough time to touch on, we covered a great amount of ground, and I think we've certainly laid out some directions for new thinking here in the hope that people will pick up on that and get themselves better informed on this subject. You're all free to go. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to once again to thank the panelists.